Alright, in this video I'll be explaining how to win with a king and two knights against a king and an A pawn or H pawn. It's a general win if the pawn is at least 3 moves from promotion, but the winning method often requires allowing the pawn to advance to just 2 moves from promotion, which is not a general win. So this endgame can be pretty tricky, and some positions can require 115 moves to force a win. Before we get into understanding this, we'll start by understanding the positions where mate is forced quickly, and then move on to more complicated positions. So, we know from the last video that if you have a 4th diagonal formation with the defender's turn to move, then you can transform it into a 3rd diagonal formation via the 4th connector formation, thereby limiting the defender's king to just 2 squares. And by knowing how to do that, combined with knowledge of a few checkmating patterns, you can solve a lot of different positions. So here we have key position number 1. In this position, the passive knight is 1 move away from attacking the 3rd square from the corner, and the pawn's 2 or more moves from advancing to promotion. So these are the makings for mating method 3, which we went over in the previous video. You should already be able to understand this checkmating sequence. So, in key position number 2, which is a forced mate in 14, we reached the previous sequence after king h7, king f7, king h8, and now, if the knight was 2 or less moves from attacking the corner square, white would be able to apply mating method 1 here, but the knight's 3 moves away, which is too slow. And the knight's also too slow to accomplish mating method 2, because remember, there's no way to force a position where the passive knight achieves a check against the 2nd square from the corner, so white needs an extra tempo compared to the first method. The only way to force a mate is with method 3, where the passive knight controls the 3rd square from the corner, and it's the active knight who checks on the 2nd square. But in order to achieve that position, we need to do some manipulation of the formation. The most natural move here would be to control the next square in the defender's path, but that's a draw by stalemate, and if white immediately rotates the formation, then the active knight would be badly placed to stop black from heading to the drawing zone near the a8 corner, and the passive knight can't control f8 the same way it can control h6, so this would also be a draw. The correct winning method is to transfer the g4 knight to f5 via e3 or h6, and then rotate the formation. And now, knight to g7 reaches a 4th connector formation, which is transformed into a 3rd diagonal formation, a rotated version from before, and now the formation's rotated once more. This time black's king is on the 2nd square from the corner instead of the corner square. This type of position was only achievable with the compromise that the active knight had to abandon its duty and leave it to the passive knight to seal off the 3rd square from the corner. Otherwise, there's no way to force a tempo gain against the 2nd square from the corner, and no way to force mate. So, returning to the start of key position number 2, we saw that after king h7, white finishes with method 3, which is a thematic pattern, but against king h5 instead of king h7, white wins with a more unique pattern in which the specific location of the pawn matters. So notice how the knights form this special fence that prevents the defender from escaping, and the obstruction created by the pawn also plays an important role. This allows white to force black's king into the h1 corner without white's king needing to play that big of a role. White's king simply follows black's from behind and gradually shrinks the region within the fence. So now if king to g1, then white plays king to g3 immediately, but against king to h1, white plays king f3 to reserve the g3 square. So now the f3 square is clear for the knight to come and seal off g1, while simultaneously freeing the pawn, and then knight f2 mate is next. So, reviewing key position number 2, this type of checking formation is often going to be the goal in cases where the defender's king is between 2 mating corners, because it forces the defender's king to make a decision about which side of the board to go to, and then the active knight is going to be preventing it from returning to the other side. So after black moves here, it's going to be clear which corner the checkmate's going to occur in, but in positions where the king is wandering up and down the h-file, it won't be clear yet where the checkmate's going to occur until white achieves this optimal check formation. So moving on to key position number 3, this is black to move and white's forcing checkmate in 23 moves, but we're also going to look at this for white to move as well as consider different locations for the active knight. So usually in a 2 knights versus pawn endgame where the defender's king is attacking the passive knight like this, the knight has to be defended directly either by its king or by the active knight. But in this special case where there's the possibility of mating with one knight, there are these really neat ways for the attacker to make progress without having to worry about directly defending the knight. And these extra possibilities are the reasons why winning against an h4 pawn usually requires allowing the pawn to advance to h3 at some point, as we'll see later. So here, the passive knight prevents black's king from escaping up the g-file, and if black captures the knight, then king to f2 forces mate with one knight. And remember that the knight doesn't have to be on this specific square, c3. There are various other squares where mate with one knight is possible, and there are even mating possibilities with the knight on either colored square, which allows the knight to move while simultaneously maintaining the soundness of the sacrifice. For example, if black plays king to g2 here, then white mates an 8 with knight to e2, controlling g3, trapping black in the h1 corner region and also controlling g1. So now if king takes h2, then white's able to play king f3 instead of king f2, utilizing the knight's control of g1. Against king h1 instead of king takes h2, then king to f2 forces king takes h2 and it transposes. So, returning to the start of key position number 3, black gets mated with one knight by staying near the h1 corner. The best move here is king to h4. Now king to f4 prevents black from returning near the h1 corner, and if black is ever allowed back near the h1 corner, then white's going to make sure the active knight is on g4, where it forms this complementary barrier and mate is forced easily. So after king h5 threatening to escape back to the center, king f5 keeps black's king on the h-file. Now if black tries returning near the h1 corner, the knight's not yet ready to jump to g4, but remember the knight's always going to be in a position to control g3 in one move, like in the mate with one knight scenario. So white makes progress with either knight to e4 or knight to e2, sealing off the g3 square. Now it might seem like knight to e4 is more accurate because that would put the knight just 2 moves away from its destination square g4, but remember white also has to consider scenarios where black's king moves toward the h8 corner and tries to run to a8. For example, after knight to e4, king to h5, knight to f2, white would win quickly after king h4, but against king h6, white has to play king f6, and then after king h7, the knight can't do much to stop attempts to escape toward a8. Although there's knight to e4, king to g8, knight to d6, king to f8, reaching a 4th diagonal formation, but it's the attacker's turn to move. White's in zugzwang here and can't force black to the h8 corner, though white still retains the win. So here, white would prefer to have the active knight on e3 instead of f2, because from e3 the knight can still jump to g4 against king h5, but against king h7 the knight can jump to f5, reaching a 3rd diagonal formation and winning easily. So it turns out that white gains nothing here by playing knight to e4 instead of knight to e2. Either move is fine, but I'll show knight to e2 since that's also possible with the knight coming from c1. So, after king h5, knight to g3 check, now king h6, king f6 leads to a 4th connector formation where black's the one in zugzwang. So black plays king h4 instead, giving white time to remaneuver the knight to e3. After knight gf1, king h5, knight to e3, white's winning easily since the knight can jump to g4 if needed, but it's also well placed to play against attempts at running toward this non-mating a8 corner. So instead of king h4, which simply allows the knight to make progress while sealing off g3, black can try king h6, forcing king f6, and now it's pretty much going to lead to the previous scenario if black heads back toward g3, because the passive knight controls g4. White has time to make progress with the active knight while sealing off g3, and white is transposing easily. So here, black can try getting as far away from the knight as possible, but king f7 forces black closer, and knight to e4 seals off g5 as well as g3, which justifies white compromising his king's positioning. White sort of triangulates, and now knight to f2 is okay when black's king is on h5 instead of h6, so white wins easily from here. But this winning method wouldn't work with the knight on c1 instead of c3, so here we'll look at knight to e2 instead of king f7, which would be the correct move if the knight was coming from c1, although here it's winning 2 moves more slowly than both king f7 and knight d5. So the idea is that white can answer king g8 with king e7, and then king g7 is answered with knight to f4, a fourth diagonal formation where black's in zugzwang and getting forced to the h8 corner. So instead of king g7, the best move is king h7, and then knight to f4 is answered with king g7, and it's white who's in zugzwang. So instead of knight f4, white simply takes advantage of black's retreat with king f7, so now the knight's gained a tempo and coming closer to the action without needing to compromise anything with the kings. After king h6, king f6, we get the same formation of the kings as we had before, but with the knight closer. This is a common theme, where the formation of the kings is repeated, but with a knight in a stronger position than previously. So now pretty much anything black does is going to lead to something we've seen before, but may be reached by a slightly different means. The themes and key formations are really what's important, not the individual moves and variations. So we've pretty much solved key position number 3. It's not very hard when we know the tactics we're going for, but the process is trickier if it's white to move, because white's king's got to keep control of the f4 square, so white has to depend a lot on the active knight for making progress. White can still move the knight to the special e2 square, which controls g1, allowing white to respond to king takes h2 with king to f3 instead of king to f2, but the difference here after king to g2 is that white is the one who's in zugzwang. Black's king is not being forced away from the g2 square, and there's no way for white to make a waste move that would put black in zugzwang. White would want to play king e2 here, but the problem is that the e2 knight obstructs it. But notice that if the knight was on f1 instead of e2, white would be able to play king e2, and the knight on f1 would still control the critical g3 square as well as defend h2, this time directly. So after king g1 or king h1, white would be able to make progress with knight e3, restricting the g2 square, and then mate is forced easily. But in order to maneuver the knight from e2 to f1, white has to utilize the d4, f3, and d2 squares, which all maintain the soundness of the sacrifice. So here white plays knight to d5. Notice how the sacrifice is still sound. Black's best move is king to g3, and then knight df3, king to g2, knight to d2, continues to exploit the variety of squares where mate with one knight is forcible. And finally king to g3, knight df1 check, and black's king is forced up the h-file, transposing to scenarios we've seen before. So now we've solved key position number 3 for either side to move, as well as for various different locations for the knight. These positions were force mate in 25 or less moves. Now let's move on to key position number 4, which is a force mate in 35 moves. So here the defender's king is far away from the two mating corners h1 and h8. The a1 corner is not a mating corner because the passive knight is too slow to accomplish any of these 3 basic mating patterns. But even though it's not a mating corner, we can still use the idea of mate as a way to force the defender toward the mating corners. So if king a1 here, then white has mate in 3 going after the corner square. Normally white would need an extra tempo to accomplish this mate, but white gained a tempo due to the fact that black voluntarily played king a1. There won't be a forced mate in any position where black stays in the corner by force. So instead of king a1, black is forced to move away from this a1 pseudo-mating corner and closer to the real mating corners h1 and h8. After king c1, king c3, we reach a very familiar formation. This is much like a fourth connector formation, except there are 3 extra lines, the F, G, and H files. So this position would be considered a 7th connector formation instead of a 4th. Without the pawn and the passive knight, then there would be no way for the attacker's king and active knight to force the defender's king into a corner. But remember, when factoring in the existence of the extra knight and pawn, the defender can become restricted from additional squares, which can often allow the attacker's pieces to corner the defender's king using a formation that's inferior to a 4th diagonal formation or 4th connector formation. So that's what happens here. The passive knight restricts critical squares on the F and G files, and the H3 pawn obstructs its king's potential movement along the H file. This causes the 7th connector formation to behave more like a 4th connector formation, in which the defender's king can be cornered by force. So if you were to ignore the F through H files and consider the E file to be the edge of the board, then we know from the 4th diagonal concepts that white's king and knight can force stalemate here. In other words, it can force black's king into this region where the extra pieces restrict extra squares. After king d1, knight b3, the knight is now in positioning for a 6th diagonal formation instead of a 7th connector. Notice how instead of reaching this position by a knight coming from d2 to b3, this position could have started as a 6th diagonal formation with the attacker in Zugzwang, and then white moves king from d3 to c3, revealing the e2 square. But after king to e2, king to d4, there's no way for black to move closer to the center. The passive knight seals off f3, and the king seals off e3. There's no way to return to the a1 corner, so black can try king f2, threatening to win the knight with king g2. Now white prepares to checkmate with one knight after knight c1, and the knight on c1 controls the e2 square, and it's also 2 knight moves away from the g3 square, which is key to mating with one knight. So after king g2, king e3, white can answer king takes h2 with king f2, and mate with one knight occurs. Anything else is going to transpose to something similar to key position number 3. So moving back closer to a1 just allows white to reach a 6th connector formation with black and Zugzwang, followed by a 5th diagonal formation. Observe the same pattern as before when the 7th connector was transformed into a 6th diagonal. Except here there's a technical difference where it's a stalemated position if white's king has opposition on e3, so here white prefers to have the king on d3 rather than e3, which is not true for most diagonal formations. So after king f2, instead of playing the more thematic move king e4, which is useless here since getting the king to e3 would be stalemate, the correct move is king to d2, exploiting the specifics of the extra pawn and knight and reaching key position number 3 pretty easily. So here instead of king e2, black holds on a move longer with king e1, so king d4 exploiting control of the d2 square, then king e2, king e4, and we're going to transpose. Everything is easily transposing to key position number 3 or something very similar. So we've solved key position number 4. Notice how it's very easy because we already know the tactics that are specific to the h3 pawn. We mostly only need to use thematic maneuvers to get from key position number 4 to number 3. Key position number 5 is even easier because the maneuvers are even more thematic. There's hardly anything new. This is much like the transition from key position number 2 to number 1, except that there's no forced mate in the a1 corner, so there's still a long way to go before checkmate. White reflects the formation to get the knight to c4 where it can check from d2. So now we've solved key positions 1 through 5. Next we'll take a closer look at these thematic maneuvers of king and knight versus king that we frequently see throughout different phases of different 2 knight versus pawn endgames. By understanding that the 4th diagonal and connector formations are forced stalemates if it's the defender's turn to move, we can establish rules for higher numbered diagonal and connector formations. If we want to refer to the diagonal and connector formations interchangeably, then we can refer to them as L formations because the key squares controlled by the attacker's pieces resemble the L-shaped Tetris piece. The L formations with the defender's turn to move are typically the strongest types of formations because the defender's king is being forced to move in one specific direction. Making progress in a two knights versus pawn endgame is almost always going to involve repetitive implementation of the L formations. I call them connector formations when the knight's on the second line instead of the third line, because the knight's immediately in a position to make progress by controlling the next square in the defender's range, thereby reaching the next diagonal formation. So the connector formations are like bridges that connect the diagonal formations together. This stems from the fact that knights have trouble attacking squares that are a 2-2 distance away, and the defender's king is at a 2-2 distance from the knight in all of the diagonal formations. So transition into a connector formation tends to be necessary when trying to get from one diagonal formation to the next. I call them diagonal formations when the knight's on the third line instead of the second line, because the knight controls two important squares that are diagonally adjacent. You can label each diagonal formation based on the number diagonal that the knight's controlling. Diagonal formations are generally inferior to their connector counterparts when it's the defender who is in Zugzwang, but the diagonal formations are generally superior when the attacker is in Zugzwang. The attacker should generally avoid connector formations where the defender has the opposition, but the diagonal formations where the defender has the opposition are generally going to match the evaluations of the previous connector formation where the attacker had the opposition. So the diagonal formations are sort of positionally superior to the connector formations. The main reason for wanting a connector formation is simply to reach the next diagonal formation. This is because the diagonal formations control the first and second lines, complementing the attacker's king and allowing it to access the fourth line, whereas the connector formations control the first and third lines, leaving the second line clear if the attacker's king is on the fourth line. It's not very hard to understand the thematic maneuvers of the L formations if you understand the positions of king and knight versus king where there's a forced stalemate. By understanding that the fourth L formations are forced stalemates if the attacker has opposition, we can establish that in a fifth L formation where the attacker has opposition, the defender's king can be forced to the perpendicular edge. In a sixth L formation where the attacker has opposition, the defender will be left with two lines of freedom. In a seventh L formation where the attacker has opposition, the defender will be left with three lines of freedom. Sometimes if the defender has too many lines of freedom, the attacker can plan for a superior L formation by juggling ideas of trapping the defender in the opposite direction. Recall key position number 4, which featured a seventh connector formation. The defender had 3 lines of freedom, but the extra pieces took care of those 3 extra lines, so white was able to make progress by forcing black's king to the F-file. In this particular position, there was a straightforward way to make progress since the maneuvers of a fourth connector formation match the correct maneuvers here. But now consider a 7th diagonal formation instead of a 7th connector. If we were to try and play out the maneuvers of a fourth diagonal formation, then the thematic move here would be king c2, reaching a 3rd diagonal formation if you think of the E-file as the edge of the board. But now white's king has wasted a critical tempo. The position's a draw after king to c2 since white can't catch up to black's king, while also positioning the knight to attack g3 in time. So, although the defender's king has 3 free lines in both the 7th L formations, the attacker's king is too passive here when playing out the thematic maneuvers of the diagonal formations. So instead of immediately allowing access to the second rank, white keeps the opposition waiting for a superior L formation. Now if king e1, then white's king is better placed compared to the last variation, so there's time for knight b1. Now king f2 is going to lead to key position number 3, so king d1, knight d2, now it's going to transpose to key position number 4, after king c1, king c3. In king e1, knight b3 reaches a 6th diagonal formation with the attacker in Zugzwang, which also transposes to key position number 4. So we saw that king e1 here allows time for a superior L formation, but a better move is king c1, threatening to reach the safe a1 corner. Now if the a1 corner was a drawing zone, then white would be forced to repeat positions with king c3, and it would be impossible for white to make progress, but since the a1 corner is not a drawing zone, white has knight c4, preparing a third diagonal formation if king b1, or king d1, knight to d2 reaches a familiar formation. So there's an important concept being illustrated here. White's king and active knight are able to improve their positioning because the a1 corner is not a drawing zone. In positions where black's king is closer to the a8 corner, which is a drawing zone, the maneuvering of the king and active knight is less versatile. In a general king and knight versus king situation, the defender's king can be forcibly driven to an edge, so the defender's king should generally only have one line of freedom. But when there's the added possibility of heading to a drawing corner, then the defender's king may end up with more than one line of freedom. So next we'll examine key positions 6 through 10, which require more than 50 moves to win, and feature 5th and 6th L formations. We can better understand these positions by matching them to their diagrams here, which visualize how many lines of freedom the defender will have if the defender is in Zugzwang. So by understanding that the defender only has one line of freedom in the 5th L formations here, we can associate them with key positions 6 and 7, which are mates in 51 and 55, and see that there's going to be a straightforward way to force black's king to the first rank, where we can then try to reach key position 3, 4, or 5. So here we have a 5th connector formation, which transposes to a 4th diagonal formation where the attacker had been in Zugzwang. Now if we pretend that the first rank doesn't exist, we can pretend we're forcing stalemate in a 3rd diagonal formation as a way to force black's king to the first rank. So if king to a2, then king to d3 exploits control of the b3 square as a means of gaining opposition, so any attempt to stay off the first rank is going to lead to a 4th diagonal formation where the attacker has opposition, which is key position number 5. So black should try escaping to the first rank as soon as possible, but if black tries the most direct escape route, king to b2, then king to d3, king to c1, then white gains opposition with king to c3. And now king to d1 can be met with knight b3, and king b1 can be met with knight d3, which are both positions we know how to win. The most complicated variation is king to a2 or king to b2 here, then king to d3, king to b1. So now after king c3, king c1, black has opposition and white doesn't have a straightforward way to make progress. Here black can answer knight b3 check with king b1 and knight d3 check with king d1. The most logical idea would be to get the knight to e2 to the optimal check formation, in which king to d1 would transpose to key position number 4 and king to b1 would transpose to key position number 5. Notice how the knight on the 2nd rank doesn't obstruct its king like it does from the 3rd rank. There are many different ways to make progress here, but I think the simplest variation is knight to b3 check, forcing king to b1 to avoid the 6th diagonal formation. Now knight to d4, king to c1, knight e2 check reaches the optimal check formation, in which the knight's not blocking its king and white's keeping opposition no matter where black goes. So it seems we solved key position number 6, but it turns out that our method takes 2 moves longer than the quickest method. Humans are often more comfortable keeping the game within a narrow range of possibilities rather than decreasing the number of moves to win at the cost of allowing more variations. So instead of knight to e2 check here, the quickest win is actually knight to c2 followed by knight to e3. Then white gains opposition with king c4, resulting in a 4th diagonal formation in the a1 corner, or a quicker win where black can't return to the a file. It shouldn't be too hard to see how this is still making progress, but it's hard for most humans to see how this saves 2 moves compared to the previous method. Most humans would feel the knight to e2 check here is the most accurate, resulting in the least amount of processes and variations. So this is key position number 7, black to move and white's winning in 55 moves. It's a 5th diagonal formation, so we know black's king can be driven to the first rank by force. After king a3, knight to d4. If king to b2, then king to b4 is a 3rd diagonal formation if we're ignoring the first rank. So we can pretend a2 is a corner square and we're forcing stalemate in that a2 corner. But if king a2 instead here, then we can't use the same method because white would have to triangulate. But after king to b5 trying to gain opposition, black has an extra rank to utilize, so king to b1 or even king to a1, Both prevent white from making progress. The correct move is simply king to c3. Now any attempt to avoid the first rank leads to a fifth connector formation, key position number 6. So this is key position number 8. It's black to move and white's winning in 60 moves. Before we wrap up learning the rest of these key positions, first let's expand on our knowledge of king and knight versus king. We've pretty much mastered the L formations. Next we'll observe the more versatile formations where we're not discriminating between different corners. If we continue using Tetris terminologies, then we can refer to the optimal check formation as a T formation, the same way we refer to the diagonal and connector formations as L formations. We saw previously that the T formation is often the goal in cases where the defender's king is idling between two corners that are both inside the winning zone. The T formation forces the defender to make a decision about which direction to run, after which the attacker usually responds with an L formation and the defender is left with only one direction to run. Notice how this exact T formation is a forced stalemate on this 7x7 board, but there'd be enough room to avoid it on an 8x8. We're going to be focusing on the 7x7 board during our studies of king and knight versus king, because the extra cornering possibilities make for more instructive studies. And also on the 8x8 board, every single position in which there's a forced stalemate happens in a specific corner, which is not true about the wins of two knights versus pawn. So the two knights endgame actually has more in common with king and knight versus king on the 7x7 than with king and knight versus king on the 8x8. This brings us back to this question I answered in the last video: can a king and one knight effectively surround the enemy without the second knight's presence? And the answer is that it normally can't be forced on an 8x8 or 7x7, since the king avoids being cornered or stalemated by swinging around the knight's premises. By looking at the range of the knight, it should be pretty intuitive that the defender's king has enough room to avoid the corners, but this still doesn't prove anything. Considering that there are a variety of formations where stalemate is forcible, it's still not completely clear whether the defender can truly avoid them. We can develop a more concrete understanding by considering these two formations, which we can associate with the I-shaped Tetris piece and refer to as I formations. In the position on the left, the knight looks more naturally placed compared to the position on the right, where the knight looks kind of awkward and off sides. I'll refer to these formations as the strong I formation and the weak I formation. There's no forced stalemate in the weak I formation, but with black to move in the strong I formation, white's achieving either a third diagonal formation or the T formation seen previously. Notice how the knight lacks control of the third diagonal in the weak I formation. This is a very useful formation to understand, especially for the defensive side. There's no way for white to force stalemate here, even with black to move. So instead of immediately trying to move away from the squares controlled by the knight, black heads toward the knight and plans on exploiting its poor placement. White continues with how he would continue in a strong I formation, but now this extra free square prevents white from reaching a third diagonal formation, and it forces white to rely purely on the knight's control of the fourth diagonal. So instead of gaining opposition here, white has to take precautions against escape attempts by preparing a fourth L formation, but this allows black to return. It's a real problem that the knight doesn't control the third diagonal, because although black's king can't forcibly escape to the fourth diagonal, there's still no way for white to make progress. This is just going to be a repetition of positions where black avoids the fourth L formation by not touching the knight. The knight's lack of control of the third diagonal prevented it from making progress while keeping black in zugzwang, so it's clear that white can't immediately force stalemate from a weak I formation, but is it possible to change it to a strong I formation in another corner? A very instructive move here is to move the knight toward the center. Now the knight is only 2 moves from this strong central square instead of 4. Now, black is forced to move away from the corner, leading to a strong I, but there's an extra file for the defender's king, so there's still no forced stalemate here. In every variation that avoids the corners, black's king's going to end up on the A file, where we can repeat the same maneuvers and force black's king to the first rank, etc. We already saw what to do in the weak I formation. We could also get this strong I formation where the defender has an extra rank. We're either reaching a 5th L formation, which will repeat one of the I formations but rotated, or we're reaching this signature symmetric formation. So there's no forced stalemate from this symmetric position, but compare it to these other symmetric positions in which there's a forced stalemate if it's black to move. White's achieving a strong I formation no matter where black moves, but it's not the same here. Note the knight's problem with 2-2 distances. So even though the knight appears to be stronger here compared to in these two diagrams, the problem is that the squares controlled by the knight don't complement its king. They're kind of redundant. The knight would be stronger if it was placed one square to the side, which is why these symmetric formations are superior. The knight's ready to jump there immediately. So here, with the knight exactly in the center, black has room to escape along both perpendicular edges. The best white can achieve is that white can choose which direction black goes. We'll use this as our signature position and show how it repeats along all the edges. So let's say white wants black to go left and black goes to the right. White wishes he had two free moves, king e5 and knight c6 check, but it's going to take some maneuvering to set that up. White does the check from the fourth diagonal. Now returning to the center allows a better symmetric formation and cornering is forced. So black instead plays against the knight's questionable placement. Now if white tries positioning the knight for a strong I formation, it only gives black more access to this edge, much like a weak I formation. So white instead controls the fourth diagonal. Now continuing in the same direction leads to a fourth diagonal formation with black and Zugzwang. So black returns. Now observe how the knight always seems to need the square adjacent to itself, but there's no way for the knight to reach it in a reasonable amount of time. White simply doesn't have enough time to maneuver both pieces optimally, so black's always going to have a safe direction to run, but white gets to choose the direction. White achieves a weak I formation, and now we already saw that there's a way to force black to the left edge from here, transposing to as if black had voluntarily moved left at the start. So we're about to conclude our studies of king and knight versus king for now, and we'll get back to the two knights in game. For now, you mainly need to know the difference between these symmetric formations. The top diagrams are forced stalemates, but since the knight's awkwardly placed, there's no way to set up these positions without allowing the defender to do something in the meantime. The knight's more naturally placed in the bottom diagrams, but the knight doesn't complement its king enough to force the defender into a corner. There's always going to be an extra line for the defender to utilize. So hopefully now, after that more in-depth study of king and knight versus king, it'll be much easier to wrap up the rest of the key positions. This is key position number 8, black to move and white wins in 60 moves. It's a 6th connector formation, so the defender ends up with 2 lines of freedom instead of just 1. We can repeat many of the previous maneuvers and confirm that black's king ends up restricted within the first and second ranks, and that attempts to stay near the A8 corner only lead to superior L formations. Now the question is whether white can make further progress and drive black's king to the first rank. Considering that black's king was allowed on the second rank in many of the positions we've seen before, it should be intuitive that white can make progress here. The only major difference is that black's king can run back to the A file, causing more possible variations, which shouldn't be an issue since we know we're going to get familiar formations. White has adequate control of the third rank, and the knight's going to have moves that split the second rank in half, making it easy to force black's king to the first rank. So usually the key to making progress in positions like this is to utilize an optimal check formation. Now white's going to have a straightforward way to make progress no matter which side of the board black moves to. Against the most direct escape toward the center, king to c4 would be too passive here. Knight to a5 is correct, controlling b3 while keeping the king controlling e3. We could have gotten this weak I formation in the position with the active pieces moved down 1 rank, but it wasn't the fastest method in that position. Here we can thematically drive the defender away from its desired edge. But instead of the thematic move knight c6, we don't need to worry about getting a strong I on the other side, since we already have the passive knight. So knight to b3 here is most accurate, keeping an eye on a4, and then a weak I formation is sufficient enough to make progress towards the right edge. In fact, the weak I formation is actually better since it complements the passive knight very efficiently. So when the defender is close to the passive knight, then the active knight doesn't have to be so active in conjunction with its king, so we usually deviate from the more thematic maneuvers in order to suit the specific the optimal check formation is very useful. So here we have key position number 9. It's a 6 diagonal formation where it's black to move and white forces mate in 64 moves. We can already tell this is a forced win without completely calculating everything, because we can use fourth diagonal concepts to predict that black's king will end up restricted within the first and second ranks, much like the positions we've been studying. We can also tell this would be a draw with white to move, because that would grant black access to the third rank, which is outside the winning zone due to the possibility of escaping to f4 via e3. But black to move allows white to force black's king to the second rank. So after king to a4, knight to d5 plans for a 6th connector while also controlling the third rank. Now the most direct route towards the center behaves like a third diagonal formation. If we're ignoring the first and second ranks, we can pretend a3 is a corner and force stalemate in that corner. King a3 here is trickier. Now remember, trying to gain opposition like this wouldn't do any good since black has extra squares to utilize to avoid zugzwang. White's best move is king to c4. Now avoiding the second rank simply allows the 6th connector formation. If king to b2, then remember white doesn't want to sacrifice the king's positioning. Better is to improve the knight. Now we're transposing to the aftermath of a 6th connector formation via a 5th diagonal formation where white's in zugzwang.
So this is trickiest if black tries to stay as close to the center as possible. We can imagine that the knight's in the center of a 7x7 board, but it won't be exactly the same. After king c2 here, the thematic move is knight b4 check, but since king to d2, knight to d3, king to d1 would exploit the d3 obstruction, the knight d3 move isn't any stronger than knight c6, which can jump to a5. So instead of knight to b4 check, white could have played knight e7, which also controls c6. So if king to e2 here, then instead of the more thematic knight f4 check, the most accurate move is knight to c3 check, controlling d1, and now it's very easy if black plays king f2 or king e1. So black has to go back to d2, then knight e4 check, king to e2, knight to g5, and once again the weak I formation is acceptable since trying to refute it thematically is only moving closer to the mating corners. The best continuation is to allow the T formation and get forced to the first rank. So we've pretty much mastered positions where the pawn's 2 moves from promotion. It's not a general win because of the one safe corner, but when the pawn's 3 moves from promotion, that corner is a mating corner, and the whole board becomes a winning zone. So, before we start looking at positions with the pawn 3 moves from promotion, first let's do a final playthrough of this mate in 70 sequence.
So here's key position number 10. White to move is a draw, but black to move allows white to force mate in 70 moves. This can be considered a 6 diagonal formation, just like with the kings on a5 and c5. We're transposing to that position very easily, much like in the corresponding 4th diagonal positions, attempting to deviate, transposing into many of the lines previously seen. Everything is very thematic if black attempts to stay near the a8 corner. White goes from a 6th diagonal to a 6th connector to a 5th diagonal to a 5th connector to a 4th diagonal to a 4th connector to a 3rd diagonal to a rotation into an optimal check formation, resulting in a checkmate or a 7th connector followed by a 6th diagonal, 6th connector, 5th diagonal. Then instead of gaining opposition leading to a stalemate position, we begin a new phase along the H-file, where now instead of mate with one knight, white's got a more forcing way to accomplish mate in the h1 corner combined with the basic mate in the h8 region. This optimal check formation wins easily. So hopefully now, after picking apart the different concepts and processes, this entire mate in 70 sequence seems rather simple.
Now that we've mastered positions with the pawn 2 moves from promotion, we can master positions with the pawn 3 moves from promotion, which might transpose into this sequence or get mated sooner, as we'll see in the next example. So consider this T formation. This would be a draw with the pawn and passive knight moved down 1 rank, but since the a8 corner is a mating corner here, black's forced to head towards the extra pieces where white can deviate from the thematic maneuvers to suit the specific. So white triangulates with the king. then maneuvers the knight to e3 where it can jump to f5 if king h7 here. So king h5 is forced, then knight f4 check, king h6, knight g4 check, king h7, king f7, h3, and now knight to e6 forces checkmate just in time. And note that we're transposing to as if the g4 knight had come from h2. So here the defender's king ends up with 2 free lines instead of 1, but it's not an issue since the passive knight controls g5. Note that this would be a draw with the extra pieces moved down a rank, but here there's not enough room for black's king to stay on the g-file, and we're transposing to the previous. And then keeping away from the passive knight only allows white to reach superior L formations extremely thematically. Here black to move is very similar to the previous, but if it's white to move and white's king dislodges, then it gives black 3 files instead of 2, which is too many. Even though black can be dislodged from the F file like in this box formation, black could simply play king e7 here, so white instead waits for a better position, and it turns out that white actually prefers to have the move here since it gives the knight time to improve, so now white's getting a 5th L formation instead of a 6th. In this position we have our signature symmetric formation. It's pretty easy with white to move, but black to move creates the possibility of escaping down the A file, so white's going to have to utilize the recurring formations we just went over, where we can transpose to as if black had voluntarily moved toward the h8 corner. Knight to c4, sealing off the 4th diagonal, so king to c8, then knight to a5, a weak I formation. This is all thematic. King to b8 avoids the T formation, then king to d7, king to a7, king to c6, king to b8, and it might look like we're just repeating positions, but white's king gained a tempo, so now any variation where black returns near a8 loses more easily. And we're transposing to as if black moved toward h8 at the beginning. So by using the raw concepts of king and knight versus king, we can establish that in a general 2 knights versus pawn endgame, there's going to be a way to force the defender's king in the direction of the passive knight, where the extra squares restricted allow extra tactics. Most of these positions with black's king on the 8th rank are going to be pretty simple since both a8 and h8 are mating corners, and many of the positions with black's king on the 7th rank are also going to be reasonably simple if there's no escape down the A file. Most other positions are going to require transposition into an endgame where the pawn's only 2 moves from promotion, because the defender can usually choose to end up on the 1st rank instead of the 8th rank, and neither a1 nor h1 is a mating corner when the pawn's on h4. There are possibilities like this, in which case the attacker can use both knights freely without worrying about the pawn's promotion. But in general, the attacker doesn't want the defender's king to be near the pawn unless there's something forcing immediately. Here white forces mate quickly by transposing to mate with one knight, or even more quickly by keeping both knights. There's no escape toward the center, so it's safe to force the pawn forward, but normally you have to stop the pawn before it goes to h3, and then force the defender's king to the 1st and 2nd ranks before it's safe to allow the pawn to h3. So, this video's getting kinda long. I think if you've made it this far, you should be able to figure out a reasonable winning method starting from any random position. I don't think I really need to go over every individual variation, especially since the quickest methods might not always be the simplest for humans to understand. I think I'll end the video with one last position which sums up the general strategy for 2 knights against an A-pawn or H-pawn. In this position, if king to a5, then black's king ends up on the 8th rank between the 2 mating corners, and then mate's going to be pretty quick compared to if king a3 here. Even though there's a forced stalemate in the a1 corner, there's no forced checkmate since the passive knight is too far away for any of the basic patterns. This would be key position number 4 if the extra pieces were moved down 1 rank, in which case white would play knight to d2 check, but white needs to provoke the pawn advance first to make h1 a mating corner, so knight to b2 instead keeps black's king contained while the knight gets as close as possible to h2, and white's going to have enough tempo to accomplish this maneuver. So now knight to e1, king to b1, knight to f3, now after king to c1, king to c3, and notice how this square that's a 2-2 distance from the corner, these squares tend to be strong for the attacker's king because they're in opposition to two different edges, so it's still easy to trap black's king in the A1 corner if he goes in this direction. So king to D1, knight to F4, suddenly the passive knight becomes the active knight, while the original active knight is ready to take on the passive role. H3 immediately holds on the longest, but trying to stall it prevents black from returning to the A1 corner. Now we get a stalemate, forcing H3 anyway. So the process of forcing the pawn to H3 was pretty easy here, but in positions where black's king is not contained in the A1 corner, it'll be a little trickier, and there might be different times in which white can choose to free the pawn. But they shouldn't be too hard to figure out, considering that we already mastered the positions with the pawn 2 moves from promotion.